All right, Joshua here. This is the lecture for the class on December 5th. I look forward to seeing all of you. We are reading something by Anthony Pinn, The End of God Talk, Chapter 1, and African American Humanist Theology, Chapter 1. And Anthony Pinn is a prominent humanist theologian. I've heard him speak. He actually attended virtually one of my classes at a UU congregation about Black humanists. It was really awesome. If you have the chance to listen to him lecture or hear him in person or read other books by him, um, it would be well worth it. You can see he is an academician by his writing, but very brilliant and a lot to think, provides a lot to think about. But two things that we should probably think about when we talk about Anthony Pinn. Well, first, how he defines theology, and he writes it right here in his book. Theology is a method for critically engaging, articulating, and discussing the deep existential and ontological issues endemic to human life. So defined, then he goes on to say that African American non-theistic humanist theology, I love that phrase, it kind of contradicts itself, is a way for any African American humanists to speak and critique their collective life stories, as these stories are guided by the structures and practice of non-theistic humanism as a quest for complex subjectivity. And that is the other term we need to define when we talk about Anthony Pinn. He coined the term complex subjectivity. And he writes about it in the book, but it's basically, it refers to the desire, the struggle, the quest to be self-determined, to find a more complex identity in the face of forces, social forces like racism and systematic oppression. In other words, not just being the subject, but more complex life meaning, a more complex identity in the face of systematic oppression. And he talks about that as expressed through, as you'll see in this chapter, the ordinary as theological source material to forge a more full existence. So complex subjectivity is one thing. The other thing I wanted to talk about, and he writes about it in here too, is you'll notice in chapter 1, he writes the word place as P and then the lowercase l in parentheses, ACE. And he talks about that here, while place, he says, PLACE without parentheses, is used to connote general locations of a physical nature. Place with the L in parentheses should be understood as a step way, maybe as a typo, a step away from this generic use. The latter, place with the L in parentheses, entails the setting of parameters and boundaries of focus around time and space so as to mark off opportunities to wrestle with fundamental questions of life. So it highlights the bilateral experience, or the two experiences of physical location and social location, or and particularly, obviously, with him, it concerns racism, anti-Black racism, as a social construct in the United States. And that L in parentheses draws us to be aware of that concept for Black people, that their place in society is often attempted to be defined by external forces, by oppression, by systematic oppression, racism, and they have a very different experience of space and place than white people do. So when you see that, that's the intention there. Let's talk about. We talked about theology. All right, so he goes into the ordinary as source material, specifically the ordinary as in the African American experience as he sees it and he defines it. And the ordinary, as he specifies, place photography and architecture, is he's using texts or contexts that are non-literal, not rather than the written word or a religious text, he is using, or even a mundane story or something, a poem or something like that. He's actually using things that aren't written down, photography and architecture, places and images to tell the story. Unitarian Universalist in our new Article 2, which defines in our bylaws, which defines our values, also has created an image. So rather than just words, which are often very limiting and can be misleading, we have an image that defines our values with love at the center, justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, and interdependence and generosity around them, and different depicted as flames coming out of love. Anyway, so he talks about photography and architecture as modalities of storytelling, which they are, providing graphic storytelling. And I quote him here, graphic examples of how the structuring of religious space and meaning is framed and articulated within ordinary life episodes and contexts. I don't remember how or where he defines religion in here. Not gonna search back and find. Oh yeah, it is argued that religious experience is religious in that it addresses the search for meaning in its most significant forms, also called complex subjectivity. It is humanistic in that meaning does not entail in that meaning does not entail transcendence beyond this world. So it's just a search for meaning in complex subjectivity. So photographs as a theological source, he talks about first, and they obviously tell the story of an individual, of a family, of the place, the time and space that's captured in that image. And he talks about the same way we can interpret religious texts in different ways, we can obviously interpret photographs in different ways. The person who took the photograph, the people who are in the photograph, the people who are viewing the photograph maybe for a first time or a second time, or are all going to interpret it in different ways based on their contexts and their status in society, if you want to put it that way, or their relationship to society. It's interesting because, and that's how people interpret religious texts. I once interviewed Abdul El Sayed. I also spoke when he for his announcement of his gubernatorial run a few years back. Now he's running for Senate in Michigan. And I remember interviewing him afterwards, and you can read that interview in the Humanist magazine. And talking about Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who wrote Heretic and some other books and was very critical of Islam, but she comes from the perspective of a female who was abused within Islam. And I'm not sure where she stands right now, but at the time she was very critical and a heretic and essentially a humanist or an atheist. And I asked Abdul El Sayed, what do you think about her perspective on Islam? And he said, well, she doesn't understand Islam as it really is, or the real Islam. And I was struck by that, because there is no, in my opinion, real or one interpretation of any religious dogma or religious text or divine story or anything like that. It's all interpretation. You can have one, another person can have another, but based on your context and your story and your perspective. When I read the Hebrew Bible, as you know, I go back and see this jealous, angry God who's unfair, and dispossession of land and misogyny and slavery and all these things, where someone else is reading it as the absolute divine truth and everything is good and everything is positive and meaning making, etc. And it's the same with photographs, as he says, depending on your context or how you're looking or where you're looking or how you're situated in time and space at the time, or at a different time, you're going to interpret, you're going to do theology on this photograph in a different way. But they absolutely, to him, are a theological resource. And then he goes on to talk about his own family photographs and how they've told stories, and how they can either support or break down existing structures, racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, et cetera, et cetera. They can break them down or they can challenge them both. And then he talks about how the photographic image actually speaks twice. The material captured, like I just said, and also the question of that which the image doesn't contain. Um, the porous nature of the photographic image, he writes, that non-theistic humanist theology invites readers to explore religiously what else is going on, what was happening when that photograph was taken, what happened before, what happened after it. I would love for us to share some photographs in the discussion. Maybe people can tell a story about a photograph. And in the response, how someone else sees that photograph. Maybe you can talk about it before you read the story of the photograph itself and just sort of talk about what you get from it, what you see in it. In fact, I think we should do that in class. And so as not to put anyone on the spot, I'll bring some photographs and I'll ask people to sort of interpret them or ask people what they see in them, photographs of myself and my family, and then I'll tell the stories of them and we can go from there and discuss it. Then he also talks about architecture as place. Um, and this is where stories happen, where people interact with the mundane, um, itself, not just looking at it, but actually interacting with it. Where, what did he say? Embodied bodies are present. Um, I'll quote him here. Simply put, architecture is the conscious and dedicated arrangement of place, with L in parentheses, physical or mental, so as to give time and space deep significance as recognized location, here it is, where embodied bodies, I love that, engage in the quest for complex subjectivity within the context of the ordinariness of life. Um, So that place is space plus something, place within parentheses. And he goes on to talk specifically about Starbucks and the African American barbershop as sort of these temples of meaning making, of theological understanding, where neither the coffee nor the haircut is the main purpose of going there, but it is the communing with the space, with other people, relationship, you know, before Starbucks came around, I never imagined going into any retail establishment and saying, I'm going to sit there for a few hours and do work. It just wasn't a thing. Now you go into Starbucks really not to get the coffee. That's an afterthought. You go in there, or any coffee shop, um, to be in that space with others and to do work or to read or to have a conversation and talk, like in a barbershop, African American barbershop, talk about existential issues and politics and work through things and think through things with friends. That's the purpose of those spaces. And they know it. I have some issues with Starbucks, obviously, right now, the way they're treating their employees and with capitalism and white supremacy culture in general. And he acknowledges the problems extant with, talking about Starbucks, and sort of says we're not, this is book chapter isn't meant to think about those things, although they're very important and they exist. It's meant to do theology on Starbucks. And he lists on page 17 the ways he does that: a study of customers, analysis of the literature, history models, evaluation of interplay of senses and of the senses, intellect, the visuals in Starbucks, the art in Starbucks, the significance of the furnishings and the space, the elements of design and architecture, the analysis of the geography of space, the work of the geographers who have been concerned with the spatial nature of the body. Uh, and then he talks about this: how Starbucks saved my life. A son of privilege learns to live like everyone else. This author, Michael Gates Gill, wrote this book about these meaningful meetings in Starbucks and how his life was changed and another person's life was changed, and how this quest for complex subjectivity, where essentially religion happens, a connection to the religious, can happen in a church. Obviously, that's the obvious one, but can happen anywhere. Starbucks is just the example he chooses first. Uh, Quote, Starbucks tries to provide a space for the exploration of life meaning by embodied selves that respect the individual, but allows the individual self to engage relationship to other selves. And it does this in a manner similar to that offered in other contexts. Then he goes on to talk about the barbershop, specifically the African American barbershop experience. And he says, the look and feel of the barbershop, the intentional and determined arrangements of its elements, encourages exchange and comfort, just like in Starbucks. The barbershop also offers, quote, a place, L in parentheses, for conversation, for self-examination, for reflection, communal engagement. Issues of socio-political, economic, and cultural importance are debated and at times worked out. And there's an added layer to the barbershop too, in that while you're in there, you're actually changing your aesthetic, your appearance. You're getting a haircut, or you're getting a procedure, beard trim, or whatever else. And he writes, there's multiple levels of meaning because of this within the framework of soft cultural norms of care, style, as well as orienting conversation and exchange that pull out deeper levels of life and meaning and ontological intent. So there's layers there of meaning, and I'll conclude with his conclusion of this chapter, where he says, through ethnographic work, attention to online and other written materials related to the barbershop as place, with L in parentheses, theologians stand to gain a great deal of information concerning the nature and meaning of religious questions on the ground, physically in the mundane. He puts on the ground in quotes. Starting with Starbucks, because it is perhaps the most difficult to embrace and a somewhat unlikely topic within the context of theological work, and moving to barbershops, the resource materials available for African American non-theistic humanist theology cover all the locations of life, the spots and structures in which and through which embodied life happens. In this way, the ordinary is given its proper and more central place as a vital source material for non-theistic humanist theologizing. So beyond the pictures that we may discuss, I'd also like us to think about and talk about different places, architecture that we encounter that facilitates this type of theologizing, non-theistic theologizing, humanistic theologizing. And not just physical places you've been, physical places you've seen. Like I said, I'm in Savannah, Georgia right now. There's so many, the whole city is full of tours and, people talking about the architecture and stories. It's like storytelling on every square and every block. If you've never been here, they actually have what's called a COA. If you want to build here, it's a certificate of appropriateness. You have to get a certificate of appropriateness so that all of the buildings are in the same style. You go downtown to Savannah, and other than a few horrendous buildings that were built before this certificate of appropriateness was put into place, before the city was really recovered as it is now. There were different times where it was not cared for. Let's just say that. But outside of that, everything has the same aesthetic or similar aesthetic that fits with everything else. And it really opens us up to this type of storytelling and meaning making and theologizing. It's images, it's history, it's everything else. I'll actually bring some pictures and I'll show you. But anyway, I'd love for you to talk about places that mundane places, everyday places that you visit and how you might interact with them, or they might interact with you, through the lens of this non-theistic theology, meaning making and search for complex subjectivity if you are a marginalized identity. All right. I look forward to December 5th. Take care.